Hi there, and welcome to today's edition of 1080's Weekly Career Insights. What we're going to be talking about today is current interview practice. So, as a little bit of an intro, we planned this session really early this year, so kind of April or May time, thinking that we would be back to normal, whatever normal is. So that was the basis for our research, really, just to find out what was happening in current interview practice. So what we're going to be doing today is talking a bit about some of the information we've gathered from surveys. We've also run a LinkedIn poll, and of course we've got anecdotal comments throughout of things that we have picked up through our current client situation. So we're going to be kind of using all of that information to go through and just talk a bit about those interview practices. So as you can see, I'm joined by Clare Endicott and Marc Whitmore. So welcome back, both of you.
Hi there.
And as always, please do like, comment, and ask questions throughout the session. Okay, so now I've just been doing all that talking, and we'll start with our first question. So over to Clare. So what were the questions that we covered in our recent client survey?
Yes, I should start by saying that the survey was anonymous. So and actually, if anyone is listening or looking at this, and participated, we are so grateful for your help. It made such a difference to give us a nice, rich points of data. So predominantly, our first question is which industry was the interview for, and predominantly that was financial services. That in terms of people who responded, also insurance, professional services, technology, and higher education, property management, automotive, and a not-for-profit organisation, and finally people in the pharmaceuticals industry.
Nice mix there. Excellent. Okay. So yeah, and the LinkedIn poll that we did was we didn't go down to that level of detail. It was purely what kind of interview have you had over the last few weeks. So we've got slightly different data coming in, but that's all good. Okay. So I've lost my train of thought. Really sorry. Are we going straight now to what were the high level results, or did you want
No,
to talk a bit more?
I think, Marc, we're going to
Marc was going to talk about the
we're going to
questions. Sorry.
yes. So, Marc, over to you on that second question.
Okay. So the second question was around, we looked at what the regions that interviews were taking place, and obviously, typically, if that was online, it would just be understanding from our clients where they lived. But in terms of the region, unsurprisingly, the majority of people who answered the survey, so I think it was just over three quarters, were based in London, and in fact, on top of that, based in the southeast. One of the things that did come out, which was just an interesting little bit of extra information, is there were two roles that people were being interviewed for. One was a role that was based in an organization. It was based in Sweden. Another one that was based in the US. But it was agreed for both roles that they could be done from London. So I think that's a very interesting, I guess maybe maybe it happened before, but I think now in this kind of new world or new normal that we live in, it's quite interesting that that those type of roles and locations are now open to all. And I guess from an organizational context, it does broaden the talent pool. So I thought we thought that was quite interesting as an additional piece.
That is really interesting. I've seen quite a lot on job descriptions now that it does specify whether they want you to be UK based or otherwise, and like you say, some are now open to international candidates as well. So yeah, that's interesting that came through. So Clare, I think you were going to talk about first stage interviews.
Marc actually was just going to chat to us a little bit about masks, as he's got some really interesting insights as to when people would wear a mask.
Oh, thanks, Clare. So yeah, so the mask thing, I think that there's probably something a little bit later in the discussion from, I suppose, not just from an organizational context, but perhaps in the kind of the world we live in at the moment. But in terms of this, in terms of the survey and people going for, in terms of around the interviews, unsurprisingly, perhaps, I think it was 80% of people for face-to-face interviews were saying that masks weren't required. And then the rest was kind of split around wearing it on the premises, wearing it during the interview, and the other one was kind of worn at the interviewee's desire, if that's the right word, or in terms of at their discretion. That's a better word. So I think, again, what's interesting about that is, again, if you look at it, are people wearing them in the organization? So they're coming into reception, and then do they wear it in the lift, and then do they wear it in the interview? So I think there's a whole piece here. And, you know, again, when we're going about our day-to-day lives, how do we navigate the wearing of the masks? And again, perhaps another area, because of obviously something to think about, is that people do have those exemptions. So whether that's kind of from a hidden disability or from some kind of respiratory illness, for example, excuse me. Again, this is all kind of a challenge potentially for the individual candidate and how they navigate that. But I guess from that perspective, for those people who perhaps are conflicted about that, the fact that most organizations are not requiring to wear masks, but I guess I would kind of class it as, you know, when you're physically walking down the road, you're about to walk into reception, you know, do you know what you're going to experience? So I think that whole navigation of do you wear a mask or do you not? Does the organization want you to? And there is that broader piece without opening a kind of Pandora's box, which is, how do you personally feel about mask wearing anyway? So that's, you know, that's an interesting area, I think, in the context of interviews.
Yeah, it is a big debate, isn't it? I know I've got friends who are they don't have to wear their mask at their desk, but they do if they stand up and walk somewhere. So it seems there's so many inconsistent messages. So I guess, like anything with interviews, you need to try and find out as much as you can beforehand, don't you? So if everyone's going to be wearing a mask, then obviously make sure you've got them. And,
what it strikes me in this is that it puts a very, very, perhaps more of an onus on the candidates themselves in terms of how they navigate it, rather than perhaps, and again, maybe from an organizational perspective, when you're inviting people to interviews and you're setting the process out, you need to be perhaps more granular and more clear on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So the next question is, how does the company conduct the first stage of interview? So we found 12% were asking for face-to-face, 84% were via Zoom or Teams or some kind of medium like that, and 4% was fully automated, i.e. no human contact whatsoever. So you might have sort of 10 questions and you would have 3 minutes to answer, but you'd have no cues from an individual to smile at you, etc., etc. Anecdotally, my understanding is that the face-to-face sort of interview quite often are small companies, perhaps where they are very keen on fit and, as you know, and they want that personal relationship from the get-go. Obviously, I can't interrogate the data further than that, but that certainly is, I heard anecdotally.
Interesting. And I think the data from the LinkedIn poll is very similar. I think 75% were Zoom or web-based, 10% were a mixture, and then the others were either face-to-face or fully automated, as you say, Claire. So yeah, it seems similar, doesn't it? And like I said at the beginning, I think we all anticipated it would be much more back to face-to-face by now. Okay, so Mark, second stage of interview, we were going to talk about that.
Yeah, and I think that the first thing, I guess, unsurprisingly, is from a survey perspective, is, you know, the sample is smaller, because I guess, you know, there are probably people who go through the first stage and either it's a one-stage process or, unfortunately, maybe they attrite from the process. What's really interesting about this, even though it's the second stage, is the majority of interviews are still virtual, are still Zoom-based or Teams-based. And again, it's interesting, I guess, that as candidates meet different stakeholders and interviewed by different people, they still continue to conduct that remotely. And I think, again, it probably comes back to what is that organization's strategy now about recruitment and assessment. And from a client, in terms of the candidate perspective, it's being clear on that. So not a big shift really for those who've got through to the second stage. Majority of them are not necessarily being invited in to have a face-to-face interview.
Okay, excellent. And then Claire, over to you for the final stage.
Yeah, and again, to Mark's point, obviously the sample gets smaller when you get to final stage. Face-to-face, surprisingly 33%. I thought it would be much higher, and virtual 66%. In fact, I'm aware of a company that has been established sort of during the pandemic and has grown to 80 people, the majority of which were hired remotely. So
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, I've just had a comment in through. So Paul's saying here, for a recent interview, I was offered face-to-face, but I was unable to do that. It's good that organisations are feeling comfortable with remote options as well in situations like this.
You were talking, Sarah, earlier about that example with that education.
I was, yeah.
I think it'd be good because it'd be good. That's kind of a really good
Yeah. So
link,
thanks,
isn't it?
Paul. So yes, I've got kind of 3 relatively recent examples. So I went to do some face-to-face work at a university, and I was talking to the head of the business school there, and she had been recruiting for lecturer positions. She had 20 people lined up for interviews. All face-to-face was the plan. She was looking forward to having like a week of face-to-face interviews, but 18 of them requested virtual interviews. So she was really surprised. I was really surprised as well. And I just thought it was interesting that actually the candidate seems to have quite a bit of say now. So, and I guess that's part of what you were saying about feeling comfortable. So if you don't feel comfortable having a face-to-face, then I guess an option is to ask if you can have a virtual interview. But I was sort of expecting it to be the employer that was dictating whether it was face-to-face or virtual, but actually in this case it wasn't. It was the candidates. And then I had a similar example with, so Paul's my husband, and he was away at the time. They wanted to do face-to-face, but they were able to fix it to a remote one, so that was good. And then my son actually had an interview, and he got pinged an hour before the face-to-face interview to say they had to self-isolate. So he had to then be really proactive and phone the school and speak to them about it and arrange for a virtual interview, which they sorted out for later that afternoon. So it was quite a big learning thing for him, actually, because he doesn't really like using the phone. So he had to put himself in that kind of fairly stressful position. But fortunately, the school were great about it. And he got the job, which is perfect.
That's always what you want,
So
isn't it?
it is, definitely. So yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Okay, so in terms of results then, what were the high-level results that came out of the survey?
I think for me, really speaking to the point you mentioned when we started, that I envisaged the results would be, turned on their head, the opposite. I thought most people at this point, when we started discussing this all those months ago, that majority of interviews would be face-to-face, and only the minority would be remotely. But I guess that just reflects of where we are in the pandemic. And maybe the intriguing thing is a year from now to kind of circle back and all have a conversation and see where we're at now. We hopefully will be in a better spot with regards to the pandemic. But yeah, what do you think, Mark?
I think that for me, there's the broader piece around how organizations generally, what their culture and how they're going to run their business going forward. So I guess I suppose phrases like hybrid working, or are you going to have organizations who are going to say, right now everybody's back in the office, and obviously if that's kind of the thought process, it's likely that that's how they would generally do the recruitment process. I think some of it maybe is around, have organizations made conscious changes to their land, their property strategy, that means there is no going back. I don't have personally any kind of sort of data insight into that, but I do think some of it will be a reflection of the organizational culture and how they want to run their business. And I suppose if I put my kind of talent hat on in thinking about organizational talent, one thing that it does do, if you think about the example earlier in the job in Sweden and the job in America, is your talent pool, particularly outside of London, just opens up. So somebody like me, I'm sat in Liverpool, I could potentially apply for a job in a variety of places, even though I wouldn't move, and I wouldn't want to be spending all week down in London or wherever. So I think for an organization, and I'm sure HRDs and heads of OD and talent are really thinking about that kind of catchment area, and do they really want to keep that recruitment process that way? Because if that is a reflection probably in the assessment, well, how is this person going to come across on Zoom? So it's almost like that as Claire said, one, you're going to get an insight to them by looking into literally looking into their home, but also how are they across the camera. So I think it's interesting around how it will change, and is it going to change any further than it has done already? Because maybe in some people's mind, you know, they have come out the other side of the pandemic. I think it's also going to probably reflect the type of organisation and the type of sector. So for financial services and professional services, for example, that's probably more equipped to continue to work remotely. So that's a nice long way of saying I don't know. It may change, but I think it'll be a reflection of strategic decisions that organisations have made, and also the culture of the business. So CEOs and HRDs who run that business. So I think we'll get I think as a candidate, you'll get a really interesting insight into the type of organisation you might be joining as well.
Yeah, I agree absolutely, Mark. And I mentioned earlier as well, isn't it? It kind of depends on the hiring manager as well, doesn't it? So if you've got a hiring manager that's not back in the office yet, then likelihood is that they're going to be interviewing remotely as well. So there's so many different variables, isn't there? And I think, like both of you, I was really expecting to be having conversations about, do you shake hands with people now or don't you, and all of that kind of stuff. But and actually, I think the comments back from the LinkedIn survey were that there wasn't any handshaking. The candidates felt like they wanted to, but the interviewer didn't offer their hand, so they were kind of taking the lead from the interview in those cases. But yeah, it was a small number of people that actually were even in that position to have a handshake. So thank you for your comment, Jill, saying useful observations in data. I've just seen another question coming through. So Temitopi, so she is saying here, I think organisations with several stages of interviews should have the initial interviews virtually, but the final stage could be face-to-face. And yeah, I think that's a really good point. And that seems to be, well, I guess 33% for final stage is a higher number than the initial ones, but hopefully it will progress. I think this multiple stages of interviews, I know we've not talked about this, but I've had a few clients recently that have been telling me that they're in these 6-stage interview process, and there just seems to be such a rise on that at the moment. Have you experienced that with your clients?
Yes, I had one client who said they still hadn't got to offer stage, but they'd had 8 interviews so far.
Yeah.
And they said it was a financial services organisation, and they said they were aware that this was the culture. And you wonder, it's really intriguing, you know, is it about the way the organisation is made up, that it has a particular matrix structure, that there are so many different stakeholders that have to sort of sign off? Or is it that slight reticent because it's all virtual, because all these 8 meetings were virtual, that actually there's not the confidence just to move forward and say, yes, we'll extend an offer? Really intriguing.
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it? I know of one organisation that apparently does the same interview, like the same questions, but 6 times by 6 different stakeholders. And you just think, that just seems crazy, doesn't it?
Well, as a candidate, you're going to be damn good at it after your 6th go, aren't you?
This is true. This is true.
But
I mean,
also, sorry, that I think it
Okay.
indicates a culture of, are my candidates telling me the truth? Because I suspect there is you know, they will put those answers together, and there's a sort of slight thoughtfulness about people coming into the organisation. You know, we're going to screen out for anyone that might not necessarily always be completely.
It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah.
I think there's a fundamental, almost commercial point there, that if the best candidates on the market are probably going to have 2 or 3 you know, things in the pipe, and if you're going to take that long to recruit, you're going to lose them.
Yeah.
So to me, above everything else, being that sort of protracted in it, you're going to miss out on candidates. And as you say, Claire, there's an inference there in terms of, you know, if you're asking the same question, you know, are you trying to catch me out? Are you all there comparing notes? So that strikes me, probably shouldn't say, it's just a nonsense, to be honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's tricky.
I think it depends on the compensation profile. I think if there is a very attractive compensation package, sometimes people will roll with it because they, you know, the end goal might be very attractive.
I guess it's the dialogue and the transparency between the organisation and the candidate. So if the organisation manages that, I mean, I've just seen Alison has put this thing on about sequential interviews, very common in organizations like Amazon. I guess,
Yeah.
you know, an organization of that brand, you're probably going to potentially kind of navigate your way through that, aren't you?
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, even for graduates, I was talking to a graduate yesterday, and she said she's been through, I think she said four different processes so far that were all 6-stage interviews. And she's got to the 3rd or 4th stage in each of them. And for her, it's been the psychometrics where she's fallen down. So one stage is psychometrics, and it's quite far into the process, but just not getting any feedback. So she's now trying to answer questions honestly, then how she thinks they might be looking for her to answer, just to see if there's any. And I just think it's really sad that there's like young people trying to get into the workplace and they're having to battle with all of that stuff and get no feedback. Really, really tough. Really tough. Anyway, back to the session. So that was the high level results we were talking about there. So and then were you surprised at the results?
Yes, I think the key surprise for me was that there was definitely a data point about individuals having no relationship, no human contact. So that would be, say, 10 questions, 3 minutes each. I'm aware of that often with graduate selection, but not so much with professional hires. I'm intrigued by this. I'm sure the organisations will have thought quite long and hard about that, and I'm sure there are advantages just because you can, go through a number of candidates much more quickly. What I was a bit thoughtful about, though, was if a candidate experienced anxiety, often it's the interviewer's job to relax them, chat to them to start off with, and that often allows you for the candidate to really give of their best, which is after all what you want. The spirit of interviewing is not to catch people out, it's to allow them to show you what they can do. So I was a bit thoughtful as to whether, without any human contact, that really enabled a candidate sometimes to perhaps fail just because they felt that anxiety. But Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, we were talking about it earlier, weren't we? I think that this is probably something that I feel quite strongly about. And, you know, when I come across articles around it, I do post. But, you know, if I think of kind of that, you know, it's a lead on from anxiety. But if you think of potentially really outstanding candidates, I guess, from a neurodiverse perspective, and more specifically, those who are autistic, you know, generally in recruitment, more and more organizations should, both from a Disability Discrimination Act, and also from identifying the best candidates, need to look at that recruitment process. And that would even be face-to-face. So, you know, examples would be having the questions given to you in advance, being able to bring somebody with you for that face-to-face interview. So it's very interesting to me where potentially when somebody's autistic, one of their challenges is around social interaction and communication. Asking them to talk to a screen and not know what the questions are, you know, from my experience, either they're not potentially going to do a good job of it, or they might not even be able to do it. So what you're potentially going to have there is somebody who is neurodiverse, and they could be very, very good candidate. So how do organizations deal with that, particularly now on the automated level? So, you know, in my view, you should be giving them the questions. You should be, you know, giving them more opportunity to practice. You might even give them longer. So there's all kinds of things to think about. But to be honest with you, if organizations from a recruitment perspective have already got those processes in place for face-to-face interview, it shouldn't be a massive extension to go beyond that. And I mean, for me, another point from my perspective is don't potentially ask autistic candidates to do that. You know, navigate the way around that. Don't ask them to record it. You know, deal with it in a different way. So there's almost, you know, when I think about it, that'd be on a personal level, that'd be quite interesting to look at in more detail. But I think that's potentially a big thing for organizations. And again, missing out on talent because of the way things are changing.
Excellent, really good points, thank you. And sounds like research going your way, Mark, to think about that a bit more then.
Yeah, yes, if I could could do. So
Yeah.
I could get around to it. Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question then. So what kind of feedback have you had from our clients relating to their recent interviews? So I guess this could be from the survey or from clients you've been working with. So, Claire, do you want to start with that one?
To put it in context, positive feedback, that, you know, it's more convenient, it's, you know, you're in your own space. Some feedback that actually is perhaps a bit more negative, where they felt that the interviewer has not put on their camera, which is, you know, that's a bit disappointing. So they're not able to make that bond, you know, that eye contact. Also, sometimes, obviously, there's been disturbances because they're in the interview has been in the family home, and the interview has been, you know, disturbed and accepted that disturbance, you know, which is obviously a little bit disappointing. Using their phones while they're interviewing, not being incredibly courteous. You wonder if they were in the workplace, and perhaps quite often most modern buildings have a window, have a, you know, even a glass wall, that actually perhaps they would be approach it in a different way, just because their manager might be walking past. And, you know, I think good organizations view interviewing as an opportunity for their own public relations. And I think we should never forget that. Yes, it is about them deciding whether they want to hire a candidate, but who's to say that the candidate, the interviewee, might not one day be your client, might not one day be in a position of authority. So you always, even if you don't hire the person, you always want them to go away having a great experience and actually feeling very positive about you as an organization.
Yeah, I think that's a good point about the doing other things whilst you're on the call as well, isn't it? I think even in meetings, you experience that so much now when people have just got into the habit of being on a Zoom call but actually doing something else on their phone. It's a really bad habit, and particularly in interviews. So, Mark, anything to add to that?
The only thing slightly, Bill, I mean, I know when I've talked to clients going for interview is just reminding them that, you know, how much they can learn about the interviewers and the organization. And again, it's trying to take that mindset of, what does this tell you about the organization? Is it the type of organization you want to work for? I think much like the interviewers have that insight into the candidate, I think it perhaps gives you that insight from the candidate to the interviewer. And again, if you're going to work for that organization, it may again be a reflection of how they conduct business and how they operate in team meetings. And so I think that would be the point that I would add.
Excellent. And the only other thing that's slightly different that I've had from a couple of clients now actually is they have had face-to-face interviews, but when they've got there, they hadn't been given all the information. So both of them had assessments as part of the interview, but hadn't been told that beforehand. So I wonder if there's this almost, I don't know, panic to get back to interviewing face-to-face, but forgetting to actually give the whole message. I don't know. It seems odd that I have two that have said the same thing. So that's frustrating. But I guess then it's that thing of when you get invited to an interview, maybe you need to go back and just say, can you tell me the format of the interview or something like that if it's not clear when you're invited, potentially. Okay, so what do you think all of this means for the future of interviews? So we have touched on this a little bit already, but any other thoughts?
I think I was speaking to a very sort of senior headhunter, and he said that even when the situation changes, as we hope it will, that he will still want to screen candidates in their own home. He says it gives me so much information without me even having to ask about them as an individual. It's also quite time efficient. So I think it will still play an element, you know, play a part of an interview selection process. My gut feeling is, though, that finals will be face-to-face when we can.
Yeah. Mark, any views from you?
I suppose the first thing is, I don't know. I think it's difficult to judge. And again, I probably would revert back to what decisions the organization have made commercially in terms of how they run their business. Do they actually now have the, you know, capacity, for example, to bring people into the business, to work in the business? And how you know, does the CEO and the board want to run that business going forward in terms of the culture they want to engender, and from an HR strategy, how does HR implement that? So I think some of it will be a reflection of the people who run the business and the people who execute the people policies, if I'm honest. But
Yeah.
I can't back that up with any data. So for those listening, that is my personal opinion.
Yeah. I think for me, I think it will be a bit of a hybrid approach. I think some are going to start off with start with virtual interviews and then progress later on, as you say, Claire, to the face-to-face. It seems to make more sense from a time perspective, I think, now that everyone's got the technology and comfortable using it.
I think I think that's a good point. I think people have probably got used to that extra time efficiency, whether it's the candidate and obviously the organisation, that you're cutting out that, particularly for the candidate, the before and after the travel.
Yeah.
What it does come back to, many moons ago when Claire and I were talking about, preparing for a Zoom interview, is how does the candidate create the focus and the energy by not doing the conventional or previous conventional, getting on a train, getting in your car. So it still reverts back to being able to manage that in the kind of the new virtual world, doesn't it, in terms of presenting yourself in the best possible way over Zoom.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. So thank you. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you to everyone that's commented. So we will finish as usual with our top tip. So Claire, your thoughts on this top tip for people to leave with?
Yeah, I think if you do feel anxious for whatever reason about the travel there, the going on the tube or meeting face to face, I think it's worthwhile exploring if the interviewer would be happy to do it remotely. To just say and have the confidence to say they can only say no.
Yeah, great. And Mark?
I suppose it's almost a consideration over a tip. I think it's for candidates. It's maybe as part of that anxiety in terms of really thinking about how you navigate the ambiguity. So, for example, what might be the questions you need to go back with? So, to pick up on your point earlier, Sarah, if you don't feel clear with what the organisation is asking you to do, then you do need to be going back and seeking clarity. However, you potentially should have been doing that before the whole world of the pandemic anyway. But I just think, for me, that's just far more important now because there are more variables. So I think taking control of the situation in the most constructive way, so as not to alienate yourself as a candidate, but recognizing there's going to be perhaps more variables to navigate. And how do you do that?
Brilliant, thank you. Just had a couple of comments through. So Michael saying great session, very interesting. So thank you for that, Michael. And Alison, great session. Thank you to all. So thank you very much for your comments. And as always, we'll go back through and answer any questions later. So if anyone has any additional questions, please do feel free to add them in. Sorry, one more. Okay, so Paul's saying thank you. Oh, blimey, they're flying in now. Okay, and Petra. So Petra's in Germany, so she's saying thanks for the invite. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Catherine Lambert and Chris Thorne, and we're going to be talking a bit about keeping resilient when you have been rejected from interview. So we have talked about this in the past, but I think we're finding that we are getting a fair few clients at the moment that are sort of going through this. So that's what we're talking about next week. So please do join us then. So thanks again, Claire and Mark. And thank you very much for all the research you've done on this, Claire. I know you spent hours and hours and hours on it. So thank you. Well, thank you. So thanks very much. See you next week.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.